I'm really excited to be able to moderate this with two good friends. We've been able to bring together Shin Takahashi, who's the chairman of the board of NEC Corporation of America, and Dan Kleiman, who's a senior fellow and also the director of the Asia program over at CNAS. I'm going to basically just frame this very quickly, but then I want to turn it directly over to our speakers to make sure we can kind of have a robust conversation, particularly given all the topics that we've been delving into. This is one of those words, digital innovation, and that are all buzzwords, and everybody might have different ideas of each of those are. But I want to start with Dan Kleiman, who's actually just written a seminal report that I hope everybody gets a chance to check out over at CNAS, Dangerous Synergies, that looks at a lot of these issues in terms of innovation and how alliances like the US and Japan can continue to innovate moving towards the future. So Dan, without further ado, let me just kick it over to you and then continue the conversation.
Well, thanks, Josh. Thanks for that introduction. Of course, thanks to the Japan Society, SIPA, and KO for hosting this cyber dialogue. We recently published a report looking at essentially alliance innovation, US, Japan, others. I would say the first rule of innovation I learned was lose my tie. So I followed that lesson to be slightly less formal. Let me start, though, zooming out a bit and thinking about kind of the geopolitical picture and explaining why the United States and Japan need to lead in digital innovation. Then I'm happy to get a bit more concrete in terms of what this might entail. First, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, our economies will need new sources of growth, and it's clear that digital innovation is one of those potential engines to restart our economies. Second, advancements in the digital domain are critical drivers of our military advantage, both the US and Japan. And if the US and Japan want to maintain our ability to have a military deterrent in the conventional sense, we'll need to be at the forefront of digital innovation going forward. Third, but definitely not last, digital technology increasingly intersects with domestic governance. And in my view, it's important that democracies like the US and Japan lead in digital innovation, as both are more likely to develop and apply technologies in ways that are consistent with freedom and human rights. These are three imperatives for the US and Japan to come together and cooperate on digital innovation, and they are made all the more pressing due to China. Beijing is certainly open about its ambitions to become the world's foremost digital power, with implications for where the jobs of the future will be created, more in China, less in the United States and Japan. Beijing is also committed to leveraging the digital domain to erode the military advantage of the US and Japan in ways that could be destabilizing for this future stability of the Asia Pacific. Third, China is harnessing its digital technology to create a high-tech model of social control and monitoring at home, and it's now exporting elements of this model abroad, with negative repercussions for global freedom online and off. So the US and Japan need to double down on digital innovation, both in its own right and given the scope and nature of the China challenge. How should the US and Japan enhance cooperation on digital innovation? Of course, there are innumerable opportunities. Many are purely commercial. I think my value added here, coming from a national security think tank, is to focus on a few areas that are squarely in the national security domain, but also have some commercial upside. So quickly, what these areas are. One is diversifying options for 5G next generation wireless. Huawei's investment in research and development and cut-rate pricing have positioned it to dominate the global market in 5G hardware. But reliance on a single supplier, particularly one that's beholden to Beijing, risks exposing both the US and Japan to a global disruption of critical infrastructure, and also cedes leadership in a key enabling technology. Another area for cooperation between the US and Japan in the digital domain is addressing digital disinformation. The software tools required to generate and promote online interference and disinformation have rapidly become widely available and are easy to use. And third countries in Asia of interest to the US and Japan are certainly vulnerable to such online influence efforts. So this is a natural area for the US and Japan to cooperate in the digital space. A third is building military network resiliency. The combat effectiveness of the US and Japan hinges on a seamless flow of information for rapid maneuver and precise targeting. But the networks of each remain vulnerable, and some of the solutions may be digital. And then finally, another area is pooling cross-national data sets. Large volumes of data provide advantages for advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, as well as machine learning. Today, however, platforms that would allow for secure sharing of curated data between the US and Japan government to government don't exist. How can we catalyze this type of cooperation? The US-Japan alliance, of course, includes a robust architecture for collaboration on technology, but room still exists to further build out new structures focused on the digital domain. Here are just a few ideas. Happy to discuss more in the Q&A. One is to establish a bilateral national security innovation fund that would focus in part on digital innovation. This fund could support all sorts of projects, from quick-fire seed efforts to road test promising but high-risk ideas, to opening incubators for startups innovating at the nexus of defense and commercial applications. And given that the US and Japan are negotiating host nation support right now, which may create more resources within the alliance, you can imagine dedicating some of those to an effort like this. The other idea I have for kind of a new structure, just to put forward, is to launch a cross-national platform to build new companies around shared national security challenges that the US and Japan have in common. In practice, what this would mean is co-locating innovators and entrepreneurs in a physical space and having them essentially build a company to develop a solution to a national security challenge shared by the US and Japan. I think the digital domain is very promising here in that a lot of the solutions to digital challenges, again, 5G is a really interesting case, have significant commercial upsides. So to me, this is another area where we could build out this architecture for digital innovation. To wrap up, with one final point, all this needs to involve the private sector front and center from the US and Japan. China is able to mandate that its companies cooperate with the government, including with the Chinese military. The US and Japan, as democracies, of course, can't and shouldn't do this. And so the two governments need to create more opportunities and incentives for the private sector really to emerge as a vital and full partner in digital innovation, both for commercial purposes as well as in the national security space. And I'll close here.
Great, thank you, Dan. You kind of laid a lot out there that I want to come back and pick up on. But before that, you've given us a national security perspective. Takahashi-san, coming from a private sector and Japanese company like NEC that is global, and a lot of the areas that Dan just mentioned are ones that you all are very interested in. What's the view from the private sector and someone who's been in this space as long as you have?
Okay, hi, this is Shin Takahashi of NEC. I'm chairman of the NEC Corporation of America. Today, let me talk about two areas of technology that we offer in the context of today's discussion. One is one of the AI technology, which is biometrics technology, including the facial recognition. And also the second is a 5G, particularly open architecture, open RAN context. About the biometrics, NEC has been marketing nearly 40 years of the biometrics technology, including fingerprinting for the state and local law enforcement. Most recently, we have been quite successful to get into a federal government, Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security and Customs Border Protection for those facial recognition technology being currently being used at the airports. One thing very important that I want to emphasize is for this technology, even the core software algorithm come from our R&D Institute in Tokyo. We have the team in the States who works on solution architect and software development. So it's really true US-Japan collaboration to build this technology. And we use the US engineers to do the software development, and then we sell this to outside of the United States. So we really need a free data flow and the data flow, free flow of ideas and technical discussion. That's very important. Also related to this technology, the facial recognition is a very beneficial technology to be used effectively, but also there is a concern for privacy and human rights. If this is used wrong way, this can be used for, it has a concern for the human rights. So, we are very, very careful about it. We actually developed the NEC Group AI and Human Rights principle almost a year ago. And in that principle, we talked about data privacy and the appropriate use of AI and how we going to, keep that and make sure that we sell the technology in the right way to the hand of the right people. And that's one thing. Next, I'd like to talk about 5G. So I think everyone know, but why security for 5G is so critical? Because 5G is not only faster speed for mobile phones, but also because of the low latency. The low latency is very, very important for 5G. So because of that, it can be used for the telemedicine, just like today's very critical, like today's situation. 5G can allow surgeons with rare specialization to perform procedures through surgical robot without delay. The without delay is very important. Connected cars, autonomous driving, remote control of construction machines. So these are very totally different way of using mobile communication in our life. But because of that, security becomes very, very important, more critical, because it can cause the issue for the safety of human. So how to build the 5G network. And I think you all know there are 5 major end-to-end 5G network suppliers. 2 of Chinese, Huawei ZTE, and Ericsson, Nokia of Europe, and Samsung Korea. In addition, to those end-to-end proprietary solution, I think it's important to provide more diversity to the 5G solution, and that is open architecture and open RAN. I think you heard the word open architecture, open RAN, but open RAN means radio access network. This is open the protocols and interface between various subcomponents, meaning radio, hardware, and software in the radio access network and core. Why is it so important? By standardizing these interfaces, we can use a more modular design without being dependent upon a single vendor. So if it's like you can use the best technology, best breed for each subcomponents, instead of you have to depend on a single vendor. So that gives more option flexibility. And in the context of US-Japan collaboration, I think this will make possible to use some Japanese technology and US technologies, including some startup, very innovative company. Even though there is a skepticism about this open RAN, is it a pie in the sky? Well, I think this is actually already being built in Japan. Like today, NTT Docomo, Rakuten, both of them already moving on this open RAN concept. And most recently, just lastly, I'd like to mention on May 5th, very recently, there's an open RAN policy coalition was officially announced. And that's coalition, the private sector coalition to promote this open RAN concept and deployment. And this includes AT&T, Verizon, Telefonica, Vodafone, and also a lot of US technology companies like Cisco, Dell, Intel, IBM, Microsoft, Qualcomm, Facebook, Google, startup companies like Altiostar, Avenir, and also from Japan, ourselves, NTT, Rakuten, and Fujitsu. So this coalition is currently working with FCC, White House, Congress members to promote this open RAN concept. And that's a great opportunity for US and Japan can collaborate. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to encourage everyone, particularly on the Zoom call, if you have specific questions, to send those to me. I have a few that were sent in advance, but I just wanted to pick off exactly where Takashi-san left off, and Dan had also mentioned the idea that particularly US and Japan are well positioned as an alliance to actually tackle some of these challenges. Some of the other panels have made reference to this, but obviously COVID has accelerated the pace of change, and a lot of the things that might have taken a couple of years to get done are happening very quickly. I guess in this COVID environment and in a post-COVID environment, how do you see that affecting this digital innovation and the cooperation. Let's start with Dan. You already mentioned a few ideas in terms of being able to work together, having different Japanese and Americans working together in companies. How do you actually see COVID actually facilitating and helping that process moving forward, along with the host nation support negotiations that you referenced?
Definitely. I mean, on the US side, and I probably follow that even more closely than what's happening in Japan, I think you see a lot more resources potentially going toward, in general, science and technology efforts. A lot of course, priority on the digital domain, 5G front and center. And so I think there's potentially a unique opportunity to leverage some of the resources that are being put into kind of the US to try to stimulate the economy and also ensure long-term American technological competitiveness, and have a piece of that go to international collaboration, including with Japan. So I think there's certainly more resources to support these types of endeavors. I also think if you look around the world at what's happening as COVID plays out, there's more impetus for cooperation geopolitically. I won't go into much detail here, but I mean, China's undertaken a very large disinformation effort, including in the digital domain, around COVID, both to obscure the origins and to kind of recast blame. And then, of course, there's a lot of concerns about various apps that are used to track COVID, but may also have privacy issues, again, originating in China. And so to me, the need for democracies to remain leaders in the digital space and put forward products that are infused with democratic ideals is even more important.
Takashi-san, I mean, clearly building off of what Dan just said, if democracies are going to be able to function in this new environment and not fall behind authoritarian regimes, and given that Asia seems to be ahead of all of us in terms of dealing with COVID, what's the role for the private sector, particularly in Japan, but also in cooperation between the US and Japan, as we kind of try to figure out ways of working in some of these gray zones or areas that traditionally might fall outside the scope of what governments might be dealing with?
I think, Dan has pointed out a lot of good points, but again, like, this COVID situation, I think, make sure that everyone has a good, communication bandwidth is very critical. So, to lay those high-speed infrastructure is an important initiative. And, I think, as I mentioned, instead of totally depend on the government, I think private sector need to work together. That's how this coalition really helping, that it's been used to network among ourselves, and there's a lot of communication going on between the private sectors, and there are also government helping to facilitate that, like DoD's National Spectrum Consortium, R&D project, 5G R&D project. That's I really appreciate that they welcome company, like us, Japan-based company, be a part of the member, and we can also work with other. It's really creating sort of like ecosystem of 5G through that activity. So, I think we need, the private sector need to take, stronger leadership to, network among the, the companies that share the same value.
So I see that Murai Sensei has already made a comment here about kind of some of the things we've mentioned. And I see Admiral Blair put a question here, but he asked about the digital innovation culture in the US being developed on secret development of new apps. Is it really best practice to try for international cooperation? I think this gets to the heart of one of the questions I had as well about if the opportunity is that there's this space for private sector to step in, what are the challenges that are going to hold us back? And I would imagine that part of the answer is domestic politics. And so I guess to both of you, what about this question of different competing cultures, and is international cooperation the right way? Do you believe that this bilateral space is a good way to move forward here? Starting with you, Dan.
Sure. So I actually see the different innovation cultures potentially being a strong point and kind of a comparative advantage, where you do have potentially somewhat different models in the US and Japan. And then actually, if you bring the two together, you get something which is stronger. And again, diversity always produces better outcomes. And so you actually get better innovation. I would say I worry more about protectionism in the US and Japan writ large. Certainly, and if you look at, and it's commendable that DoD is working on kind of 5G with a suite of international partners. But if you look at a lot of legislation and the way the U.S. government and many allied governments do business, there's a strong domestic preference, even when it may not make sense in terms of getting positive outcomes quickly. So I would say I worry maybe about the kind of protectionist sentiments built in often to kind of acquisition and legislation. I worry less about kind of clashing innovative cultures. I actually think that could be very healthy.
How do you kind of take that? And the specific question is, what's the best pathway forward in terms of these different cultures and actually just systems that would allow this? Because in the Security Alliance, we have a very well developed kind of process, and in both militaries are doing no matter what the politics, they fairly deal with this. In this space, depending on what happens in Washington, today's executive order President Trump signed about social media could have an impact here and there and chilling effects. How does that play out in terms of this alliance piece of it?
I think, the innovation can occur, with among different cultures. Only the things I'd like the government to be careful about is, there are a lot of discussion of export control and also investment control, like a CFIUS. And I totally understand that we need that stringent export control for the national security. I think we need to be, careful about, where I think we need a clear rule and a clear criteria of, what to be restricted. And otherwise, as I mentioned, our biometrics facial recognition technology is really a joint development by Japanese engineers and our American engineers. But if there is any sort of restriction of the data exchange or idea exchange between, because of the border, that's going to, make it very difficult. So, while those restriction controls are very critical, I think we need a very clear criteria on that.
Great. Let me just ask the last question, try to wrap this. If you were sitting in your respective capitals and giving advice directly to both the president or the prime minister on the government side, but also in terms of private sector, and you could give those very quick recommendations, what would they be, starting with Dan?
It's a great question. I mean, I would say to prioritizing moving quickly and potentially starting at small scale. I mean, I think trying to kind of come up with a grand solution for more digital innovation cooperation between the US and Japan is probably not the right approach. I mean, you saw in some of the recommendations that I put forward in my opening remarks that starting small and building up on proof of concept is the right way to go. I think it's also the right way to get the private sector on board, where if you can show results quickly, vice kind of a very long deliberative process that may or may not deliver payoff.
Great. Takahashi-san?
I think we are, in the third countries like Africa, Indo-Pacific countries, Latin America, those third countries, outside the US, Japan, there are competitions. And I think we like to make sure that we are going to, build those digital infrastructure, trusted digital infrastructure. And in order to do that, I think, to make sure what kind of value we bringing in, I think we need to make sure to the those third country leadership about, what we are bringing is a trusted network and with the respect to the privacy and human rights. That's one. But also, financial support probably is also needed in competition. And, I think there are a lot of good discussion between financial institute, between US, Japan, for example, US DFC and Japan's JBIC. I think they are in discussion to how to create financial support to those third countries. And I think that's another element important.
Great. Well, I'm going to make sure that we end on time, but I want to just kind of thank both of you for your comments. You know, what I drew out of this conversation is that we're just at the beginning of a much broader conversation. And it seems to me that by putting a spotlight on the idea of digital innovation, by fostering it through both support financially, but also to simply talk about it, to name it, to talk about the challenges we have in confronting an adversary or a challenger, a competitor, whatever term you want to use for China and kind of the public and private space that we have to deal with in open markets and democracies will be challenging. And also having a free and open architecture, whether that's simply on the sea lanes side of things, but also in terms of the cyber domain that both of you talked about. So I take away from this conversation the hope that there are opportunities out there, but also realizing that the challenges are very much out there. And so if we can start with the group that we have today to think about those trusted networks and allies that are out there, there's a lot to build on here. And, you know, in the same way that after World War II, the US and Japan kind of built this entire infrastructure of an alliance, seems to me that particularly after COVID, there might be this opportunity. And indeed, we're already seeing it today, whether it's the bills that we see passing out of the Diet or out of Congress, that we could find a way if we were able to have this conversation. So I want to thank Dan Kleiman and Shin Takahashi for enlivening the conversation and kind of putting their food for thought tonight and this morning for Japan and New York. And I'll turn it back to Greg to make sure that we stay on track. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us, and all of you for listening.